We've talked in previous classes about a couple of different ways of classifying and categorizing languages. One of those ways was historical. We've also talked about sociological, dialectal ways of classifying languages. This time we want to talk about something that's a little bit messier, a little bit more complicated. The idea of the linguistic area is very similar to an idea you may have heard in an anthropology class or just picked up from somewhere, the culture area. Imagine that two groups share anything. Say a style of pottery, a style of dress, a style of dancing. How is it the case that they come to share those things? Well, if you start doing a bunch of research in the anthropological world, you start arguing for a couple of broad culture areas that split into the sort of Northeast and the Midwest, a broad plains area that crosses into the Canadian plains, etc. We're going to be discussing something slightly different though, because we're going to be focusing on language. In general, there are only three ways that anything could come to share features. This works for languages, it works for styles of pottery, and frankly, it also works for species. Check with your biology professor about that one, though. It could be accident. So, for instance, we pretty much all presume that there's some kind of universal grammar, some kind of inherent cognitive, biological process, machinery, whatever, for language. A specialization for language. That means that all languages are going to be fundamentally similar from the perspective of the oft-constructed Martian linguist. But also, there's just so many pieces that you have to work with. Languages only consist of so many sounds. It's also the case that a language could share a feature with another language because they're in fact related languages, so they've actually just inherited that feature from a common ancestor. However, it's also the case that sometimes things just spread. And so often, speakers, when they're in contact with one another, will borrow words from one another. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today is based on the work of someone actually who's pretty local to here, Sally Thomason. Sally Thomason got her PhD from Yale in 1968. She got tenure in Pittsburgh in 1986. She worked there for many years before coming to University of Michigan in 1999, where she has worked forever. And since 2016, she's the Bernard Bloch Distinguished University Professor of Linguistics. In short, if you're a professor and you have a job that has a name attached to it, you're pretty much a big deal. She's done an absolute ton of work when it comes to language contact, borrowing, and linguistic areas. We will define a linguistic area, kind of following her work, as a contiguous geographic region involving 3 or more languages that have to share structural features as a result of contact, as a result of borrowing, as a result of diffusion. Those languages could be related, they could be unrelated, but whatever features we're talking about as the areal features, the structural features that are shared, have to be because of contact. Now, it's of course not always the case that contact leads to a linguistic area. There's all sorts of factors that come into play there. There is so much local, cultural, social context, political, historical context that makes a difference. But it's definitely got to be a contiguous geographic region. You can't just pick 2 random spots and claim that that's a linguistic area. A linguistic area, when people talk about this, they also use the German word Sprachbund to refer to just like an area, a region. It's got to be somewhere that's contiguous. Otherwise, we're talking about some other kind of relationship. Also, it has to be 3 or more languages. If we're only talking about 2 languages in contact, borrowing from each other, gaining structural features, then really you could make a broad argument that everything is an area. It also has to be structural features. Again, for the same reasons. If we count just everywhere that shares vocabulary, all of a sudden everywhere that has the word Coca-Cola is potentially a structural sort of linguistic area. That's not really what we're talking about here. Also, there's a lot of questions out there that we could research about how much information should these things share, how many features is enough, is 2, 3, does it have to be a lot? And I have one unified answer for all of this. So we're going to talk today about some languages spoken in the Pacific Northwest of what is now the United States and Canada, out in British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, Alaska, and California. This is going to consist of an absolute bunch of languages, but they're bounded pretty hard on the east by a set of mountains. This is a temperate rainforest. We often don't consider the fact that there are rainforests in North America, but this is a rainforest. And it is an incredibly biodiverse place, as well as a linguistically diverse place. There are an incredible number of languages and unrelated language families spoken in this area. For instance, there are Na-Dene languages, Athabascan languages, that is to say, languages related to Navajo, related to Alaskan languages, Tsimshianic languages, Wakashan languages, Salishan languages, and all sorts of others, including language isolates. As a few caveats here, there are definitely some features that we talk about that are not unique to this area, and some of the features that we're going to talk about are not found in every single language of this area. That's pretty typical. There are also a bunch of cultural similarities in this area. That's a really important point here. This is sort of like anthropological linguistics. If this picture we note is from a particular group in the Pacific Northwest, and note the style of art, the style of the totem poles as they're called by us out here in the Midwest, and then compare this with an unrelated group from Alaska, and you see that there's a lot of similarities in the kind of style of art, at least broadly speaking. This isn't a visual style class, so we won't be able to get into the good details here. And then there's also a lot of shared cultural practices. So for instance, a lot of groups in the Pacific Northwest practice what's called the potlatch. The potlatch was a sort of economic redistribution system / gift-giving feast, and it was criminalized by Canadian and American authorities for a very long time. As far as typical features of these languages, you often phonologically see a very small vowel inventory. That's pretty typical in a lot of languages of North America, as we'll talk about, but we also see a really, really large consonant inventory. There are some incredible consonants and consonant clusters here. We see some pretty complex sounds within that large consonant inventory. We see ejectives and plain consonants contrasting, but we don't see voiceless contrasts. We see a lot of post-velar consonants, that is consonants. We don't see very many labial sounds, including nasals, which is super, super weird. Most of the world's languages have nasals. So when you run into a whole bunch of them, unrelated languages that don't have nasals, it's noteworthy. These languages also are known for having a lot of different L sounds, voiceless Ls, palatal Ls, all sorts of wonderful Ls.
Hello everyone, all my fellow tribal people, my friends, my relatives, and my children, grandchildren. It's really nice outside today. The sun is shining and it's very warm. It feels really good. And when you say it's already spring, Skept, Istj, to chant, Tzika, to feel,
And then there's a couple of tough ones. Tlo-quali, it's like a titla, tlo-quali, blackface society.
Morphologically, these languages are known to be complex. It's very common for them to have all sorts of reduplication patterns, to not have tense systems, but to have other aspectual markers instead, as well as optional plurality. Again, very not super common in the world's languages. They're polysynthetic languages typically, with a number of lexical suffixes that add derivational meaning, with a lot of suffixes rather than prefixes, again, all together in this area. There is less work in linguistic areas typically on syntax. Most of the work that's done on linguistic areas focuses on phonology and morphology. However, we can say that a lot of these languages are verb initial. Out here in the Midwest, the languages spoken out here don't tend to be verb initial. Also, just generally speaking, semantics is way, way understudied in the endangered and minority languages of the world. However, this is changing. I'd like to give a couple examples of just some really complex consonant clusters and roots without vowels, as well as suffix morphology, all sorts of the wonderful complex pieces of these languages. This is from Nukalk, and we see here entire clusters of incredible consonants. In Lushotseit, we also see some of these same complex consonant clusters. The 7 here, and also here stands for a voiceless L, typically, or a voiceless palatal L of some kind. We also see this complex suffix morphology that we're talking about, right? So this sentence is glossed as "so you are still alive in spite of the sickness." And we see that this is live as the root, and then following that is cause, middle voice, which is in between passive and active, still evidential marking, and then the second person singular. So it's like, so apparently you still are in this process of being alive. This is the reduplication patterns that we were talking about earlier. We see this in two different language families to see kind of similar meanings. And again, it's pretty common for languages that have reduplication to have similar uses of reduplication, but it is weird to have all these languages all concentrated together that all use reduplication in a similar way. This is an example from a language, Nu-Chanuth, which I'll show you an example of. And in it, we see this by here seems to be functioning as a verb. And you get this house by as like an action that has a past tense suffix and a third singular suffix with man as a sort of object or subject of it, but it's verb initial. So you get the single argument man, house by. Here we see by is actually just standing here by itself. So it's by, past tense, third singular, man, house. So we get verb, subject, object. However, here the object, house, has been caught up into the verb. It's been incorporated into the verb. This is something we'll talk a little bit about when we talk about Native American languages as well. Mostly we'll talk about in more advanced syntax classes. Some of these languages really push the boundaries of what do you consider to be a subject, and what do you consider to be an object, and what do you consider to be a verb? What do you consider to be a noun? Here we see a sentence, the coyote goes along, or a coyote goes along. And we see this determiner with this coyote and then some sort of existential suffix, with go along being presumably the verb in the initial position here. Here, however, in the initial position, we see coyote with the determiner, in fact, attached to go along, and then the existential suffix. And it kind of looks like now this is the noun and this is the verb. I'll leave those philosophical arguments to another class. A lot of these languages also have relatively free word order. So here we see the chief arrived in both directions. We see this question, did your friend wash your car? Wash question marker, your friend, your car. But it can also be asked the other way, wash question marker, your car, your friend, with apparently no or little meaning difference. And so think about what those features look like that allow us to classify that as a linguistic area. All these unrelated languages and related languages coming together with these kind of rare, weird, typologically marked features. These complex sets of laterals, these really complex consonant clusters and syllables without vowels. These kind of unique morphological components that all seem to recur in the languages all of the area. All these other features too that just not every language seems to have. So let's compare that with these sets of languages from the Plains area. Now we're talking about languages like Arapaho, like Crow, and like Arikara, as well as a number of other languages. This is, again, a really linguistically diverse area of the continent. Not as much as the jungle rainforest, the Pacific Northwest, but pretty linguistically diverse. There are 33 languages in this area, including Athabascan languages, again, like we saw in the Pacific Northwest, but also Algonquian languages, Siouan languages like Lakota and Dakota, Tanoan languages, Uto-Aztecan languages, and so on. This stretches across again into Canada, almost touching down into Mexico. It consists of several dozen languages, like we just said. But is it a language area the same way that we understand the Pacific Northwest to be a language area? Like if you go and you meet a linguist and they know about this stuff and you say, is the Pacific Northwest a language area? They say, oh yeah, probably. Or they'll have a good argument about it. Is this a linguistic area? It's, again, it seems to be a culture area. Showed up on that map that we showed in the beginning of this video. A lot of groups use teepees out in this area. A lot of interesting uses of feathers, mode of dress and mode of living that a lot of people consider to be just regular native is actually unique to the Plains area or shared by Plains people. There's a reliance on buffalo traditionally in this area, many of which were eradicated by the United States government. However, it is important to note that a linguistic area is not necessarily the same as a culture area. Relatively recently, it seems to be the case that the plains emerged as a culture area, and for instance, with the introduction of horses and all these other sorts of post-colonial innovations driving people together in this area. A linguistic area seems to require a lot more further sort of time depth to develop. There are a few linguists over time who've tried to define the plains as a language area, and they've said, well, there's a lot of person marking as verb prefixes in the languages of this area. The languages of this area mark the subjects on verbs. The languages of this area typically only have one series of stops, have particular kinds of morphological distinctions, for example, in the possession and in the nouns that we've talked about earlier in the semester. These languages also appear to sometimes have the phoneme h. But these are kind of common elsewhere. These are sort of not that unusual typological traits. You could construct a typological map of alienable and inalienable distinction languages, that is, languages that mark the distinction between something that I could lose, like this cup, and something that would be a lot harder for me to part with, like this hand. A lot of languages mark that distinction. That's not all that interesting. Not all that rare of a phoneme. Another group of linguists identified features like S being a diminutive marker commonly in these languages, or different kinds of patterns of speech. However, this doesn't seem to be enough for most linguists to consider the plains a language area, a real Sprachbund. So we call it maybe the beginning of a language area, or something that's incipient. There's some other sort of famous examples of language areas. The Balkans is perhaps the world's most famous linguistic area. The languages span several different subfamilies, Romance languages, Slavic languages. They are, however, all Indo-European in this area. The languages of this area are also known for having high mid-central vowels, vowel harmony, pleonastic object markers, a future construction that's expressed with the verb want. Things that are kind of unique, or maybe a little more unique than just having h. Sepik River Basin is a really good example of how many different parts of Papua New Guinea are known for having aerial features. And so it's a small example of just 3 languages, but between the 3 of them, they all share, kind of contrast to the outside languages, palatal consonants, really complex and interesting tense systems, and then really complex overlaps of other features where 2 of them will share this feature and then the other 2 will share that. So you can reconstruct some of the sources for some of these, but some of them just really seem to be very deep back into history. Next time, we're going to continue this discussion and sort of talk broadly about Native American languages. Well, we can't really consider Native American languages to be a linguistic area per se. We can discuss a lot of things that are more common in Native American languages and kind of grammatical interesting facts about them, as well as other non-grammatical facts. We're going to talk about the myth of the Amerind language family. I'll explain a little bit more about what that means next time. And we'll give a little bit of history and a little bit of prehistory.